I sat at the polished mahogany table in the Hartley estate, the kind of place that screamed wealth without saying a word, crystal chandeliers, oil paintings of stern ancestors staring down, and a faint smell of lavender that clung to everything. My in-laws, Silas and Lorraine, sat across from me, their faces carved with that smug confidence only old money can buy. My wife, Camille, was next to me, her hand resting lightly on my arm, playing the part of the perfect daughter like she'd rehearsed it her whole life. I'd spent the last 10 years clawing my way up in property development, turning rundown shacks into homes people dreamed of owning. I didn't come from their world, but I'd built my own, and I was proud of it. That night, I figured we'd raise a glass to something, maybe Camille's promotion at her design firm or some family milestone I didn't care much about. The food was good, the wine was better, and I was halfway through a bite of roasted duck when Silas cleared his throat and slid a thick stack of papers across the table toward me. "Sign this," he said, his voice low and steady, like he was telling me to pass the salt. "All your assets now belong to the family." I froze, covering midair, and glanced at the document. It wasn't a toast. It was a takeover. Camille squeezed my arm and smiled, her eyes bright and casual. "It's just a formality, babe," she said, like she was asking me to sign a grocery receipt. But I wasn't shocked, not really. I'd seen little hints over the years, the way they talked about family wealth, like it was a living thing that needed feeding. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch, feeling their eyes on me. Then I smiled, slow and deliberate. "Then you'll love what's in my safe deposit box," I said. The words hung there, heavy as the chandelier above us. Silas's brow furrowed, Lorraine's wine glass paused halfway to her lips, and Camille's smile faltered just enough for me to notice. They didn't know what I meant, and that was the point. I'd been preparing for something like this, even if I hadn't admitted it to myself until that moment. The room went quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your chest, and then the front door creaked open. My lawyer, Teresa, stepped in, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor, a manila envelope tucked under her arm. She didn't say a word, just nodded at me and took a seat like she'd been invited. Silas's jaw tightened, and I could almost hear his teeth grinding. Lorraine set her glass down hard enough to make the table rattle. Camille's hand slipped off my arm, and she stared at me like I'd just pulled a gun. "What's this?" she asked, her voice sharp now. No trace of that sweet tone she'd used earlier. I didn't answer right away. I just kept smiling, letting them stew in it. Teresa opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper, not the whole stack I'd been working on for months, just enough to make a point. "We'll get to that," I said, nodding toward the contract Silas had shoved at me. "But first, let's talk about what I've been keeping safe." Their faces changed then. Silas went red, Lorraine went pale, and Camille looked like she wanted to bolt. They thought they had me cornered, that I'd roll over and hand them everything I'd built because I loved their daughter. And yeah, I did love her, once. But love doesn't mean you stop paying attention. I'd known for a while that the Hartleys weren't just a family, they were a machine, and I was the latest part they wanted to bolt onto it. What they didn't know was that I'd been watching them too, collecting my own pieces, waiting for the moment they'd overplay their hand. And here it was. Teresa slid the paper across the table, and I watched Silas's eyes dart to it, then back to me. He didn't pick it up. He didn't have to. The game had shifted, and they could feel it. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and looked right at Silas. "You want my assets?" I said. "Fine, but you're going to have to earn them." The air in the room thickened, and for the first time that night, I felt like I was the one holding the cards. They'd walked me into their trap, but I'd brought my own door out. And now, they were the ones who didn't know what was coming next. 6 years ago, I was standing in a crowded room at a networking event in Austin, nursing a cheap beer and scanning the place for anyone worth talking to. That's when I saw her, Camille. She was leaning against a high-top table, laughing at something a guy in a bad suit said, her dark hair catching the light just right. She had this energy, like she could pull you in without even trying. I wasn't looking for anything serious. My days were full of sawdust and blueprints, flipping small houses into something people could call home. I'd built my business from nothing. No trust fund, no handouts, just me and a beat-up truck. But when she turned and caught my eye, I felt it. A spark, a pull, whatever you want to call it. I walked over, introduced myself, and we hit it off. She was sharp, funny, and had this way of making you feel like you were the only one in the room. By the end of the night, we'd swapped numbers, and I was already thinking about the next time I'd see her. That's how it started, simple, easy, like something out of a movie. She told me she worked in design, had an eye for color and space, and I liked that. It felt like we could fit together, you know? I'd build the houses, she'd make them beautiful. A few weeks in, we were dating, and I was hooked. But looking back, there were signs, little cracks I didn't want to see. Like the first time we went out for dinner, and she forgot her wallet. I paid, no big deal, but it happened again. And again. She'd laugh it off, call me her hero, and I'd let it slide. Then there was the time she suggested I buy a rental property under her name. Tax reasons, she said, waving her hand like it was obvious. I didn't do it, but I didn't question it either. I told myself she was just practical, maybe a little spoiled from growing up with the Hartleys. Her family was a whole other story. The first time I met Silas and Lorraine, they sized me up like I was a used car they might buy if the price was right. Their house in Charleston was huge, all pillars and manicured lawns, the kind of place that made you feel small even if you didn't want it to. They talked about legacy a lot, how the Hartley name meant something, how it had to be protected. I nodded along, thinking they were just proud, maybe a little old-fashioned. Camille fit right in with them, all charm and grace, and I figured I'd won the lottery, a beautiful wife, a solid future. But there were moments that stuck with me, things I brushed off because I didn't want to ruin what we had. Like when she asked for my banking login one night, saying it was just in case something happened to me on a job site. I laughed and said no, but her face tightened for a second before she smiled it away. Or the way her parents kept asking about my business, how much I made, what my properties were worth, like they were taking notes. I told myself it was normal, that rich people were just nosy. Love does that to you. It smooths over the edges, makes you ignore the red flags waving in your face. I wanted to believe in us, in her. So I did. We got married 2 years later, a small ceremony because I didn't have much family and she said she didn't want to fuss. I was happy, really happy. But even then, I'd catch her on the phone with her parents, whispering about money or plans I wasn't part of. I'd ask, and she'd say it was nothing, just family stuff. I let it go because I trusted her. That's the thing about trust. It's a choice you make until it's broken. Looking back now, I see it all so clearly. The Hartleys didn't just welcome me into their world. They were studying me, figuring out how I could fit into their machine. Camille wasn't just my wife. She was their scout. I'd built my success brick by brick, and they saw it as something they could claim. 6 years ago, I met a woman who made my heart race, but I didn't know she'd been trained to spot a mark. I didn't know they'd been planning their move from the start, and I didn't know how much I'd have to lose before I figured it out. The dining room felt like a battlefield that night, the air thick with tension you could cut with a knife. Silas sat at the head of the table, his contract still in front of me, that smug look on his face starting to crack. Lorraine was sipping her wine again, but her hand shook just enough to give her away. Camille was next to me, her chair pushed a little closer than before, like she could charm me into signing away everything I'd built. The document was right there, all legal jargon and fine print, but I didn't need to read every word to get the gist. They wanted my assets, my properties, my investments, even the cash in my accounts. Dumped into some family trust they controlled, I'd be left with nothing to my name, just a signature on a page that handed them my life. Camille leaned in, her breath warm against my ear, and whispered, "Trust me." Her voice was soft, the same tone she'd used 100 times to talk me into things, a weekend trip, a new couch, whatever she wanted. But this time, something snapped inside me. I didn't trust her, not anymore. I'd been playing along for years, ignoring the little lies, the hints, the way her family treated me like a tool instead of a son-in-law. That whisper was the last straw. I pulled back, looked her in the eye, and smiled. Not the warm kind, but the kind that says I've got something up my sleeve. "Then you'll love what's in my safe deposit box," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The room went still. Silas's fork clattered against his plate. Lorraine's glass hit the table with a dull thud. Camille's smile froze, and I could see her mind racing, trying to figure out what I meant. They didn't know I'd been onto them for months. Not fully, not at first, but enough to start covering my tracks. It started when I caught Camille on her laptop late one night, scrolling through my business accounts. She said she was just curious, but I didn't buy it. After that, I hired Teresa, my lawyer, to dig into things. She'd warned me Camille's behavior wasn't normal. Too many questions about money, too many suggestions that didn't add up. So I'd started keeping records, bank statements, emails, even a few recordings of conversations where she or her parents pushed too hard. I'd stashed it all in a safe deposit box at the bank, just in case. Now, That just in case was here. Silas cleared his throat, trying to take charge. "What's in the box?" he asked, his voice rough, like he was already mad he didn't know. I didn't answer right away. I let the question hang there, watching them squirm. Camille's hand brushed my arm again, but I shook it off. Lorraine's face was pale now, her lips pressed tight. They thought they had me pinned, that I'd signed their contract because I was too soft or too in love to fight back. They were wrong. That's when Teresa walked in, her timing perfect, like we'd planned it. She didn't knock, just pushed the door open and stepped inside, her black blazer sharp against the soft glow of the chandelier. She carried a thick file under her arm, the kind of thing that screams trouble if you're on the wrong side of it. She sat down across from Silas without a word, set the file on the table, and looked at me. I nodded. "What the hell is this?" Silas barked, slamming his hand on the table. The dishes rattled, but Teresa didn't flinch. She opened the file and pulled out a single page, a summary, just enough to make them sweat. "This," I said, leaning forward, "is what happens when you try to play me." Camille's eyes darted between me and Teresa, her confusion turning to something sharper. Fear, maybe. "Babe, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice breaking a little. I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on Silas. "You want everything I've got? You're gonna have to deal with what I've got on you first." Teresa slid the page toward them, but Silas didn't touch it. Lorraine reached for it, then stopped, her hand hovering like it might bite her. The charade was over. They'd spent years pretending to be this perfect, untouchable family, and I'd let them think I was buying it. But I'd been awake the whole time, watching, waiting. Now they knew it. The masks were off, and I wasn't the one who looked scared. The air in my office felt heavy the next day, like the weight of that dinner was still pressing down on me. I sat at my desk, a cheap IKEA thing I'd had since the early days of my business, staring at the stack of papers Teresa had spread out in front of me. She was pacing, her voice steady but sharp, like she was cutting through the fog in my head. "They're not just manipulative," she said, stopping to look me in the eye. "They're desperate." I rubbed my temples, trying to make sense of it all. The Hartleys had always seemed so solid. Silas with his stern handshake, Lorraine with her perfect hostess smile, their Charleston estate gleaming like a monument to their success. But Teresa's words hit hard, and the pieces started falling into place. I'd been so busy building my own life, I hadn't looked too close at theirs. Now I had to. After the dinner, when Silas's contract landed in front of me and I dropped my safe deposit box bombshell, I knew I couldn't just sit back. I needed answers, real ones. So I'd called Teresa that night, told her to dig deeper, and hired a private investigator named Cal Reyes to help. Cal was an old buddy from my house-flipping days, a guy who could find dirt on a saint if you paid him enough. I wanted him to focus on Camille, my wife, the woman I'd promised forever to, who'd smiled at me like I was a fool while her dad tried to rob me blind. Teresa sat down across from me, flipping through her notes. "The estate's not paid off," she said, tapping a line on a financial report. "Silas took out a second mortgage 3 years ago, and they're behind on payments." I frowned, leaning forward. That big house, with its marble floors and endless gardens, wasn't theirs free and clear? It didn't add up. "There's more," she went on. "Silas has a handful of shell companies, fake businesses set up to move money around. They're all losing cash fast. Whatever wealth they had, it's smoke and mirrors now." I let that sink in, my stomach twisting. The Hartleys weren't just greedy, they were broke. And I was their lifeline. But it was Cal's report that really got me. He dropped it off an hour ago, and I'd been staring at it ever since. Teresa handed me a folder with his findings, and I opened it, my hand steady even though my head was spinning. Camille had secret credit cards, 3 of them, maxed out, all in her name but tied to addresses I didn't recognize. She had bank accounts I'd never heard of, small ones, with deposits that didn't match her design job salary. And then the kicker, she'd used my name, my social security number, to apply for a loan 6 months ago. A big one, 50 grand. I hadn't seen a dime of it. "She forged my signature?" I asked, my voice low, like I didn't want to hear the answer. Teresa nodded. "Looks like it. The bank approved it, and the money's gone, wired out to one of Silas's shells, probably." I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking under me. My wife hadn't just lied to me, she'd stolen from me, used me like I was some kind of ATM. I thought back to all those times she'd asked about my projects, my profits, acting like she cared about my work. It wasn't love. It was reconnaissance. I wasn't her husband to them. I was their exit plan, a way to climb out of the hole they dug themselves into. I closed the folder and looked at Teresa. How bad is it for them? She crossed her arms. Bad. If the bank catches wind of this, or the IRS, they're done. Foreclosure, lawsuits, maybe jail. I nodded, letting that settle. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for them, Camille especially. I loved her, built a life with her, dreamed about kids and a future. But that part was shrinking fast, drowned out by the cold truth staring me in the face. They played me, all of them, and I'd been too blind to see it until now. What's next? I asked. Teresa smiled, just a little. We keep digging. Cal's still on it, and I'll start pulling legal options. But you've got enough already to fight back, hard. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the street below. My truck was parked there, the same one I'd driven when I started this business. It was beat up, but it was mine. Everything I had was mine, until they tried to take it. I turned back to Teresa. Good. Let's bury them with it. I was sitting in my truck outside a dive bar in Atlanta, the engine off, the windows cracked just enough to let the humid night air creep in. My hands were tied on the steering wheel, even though I wasn't driving, hadn't moved in 10 minutes. I'd just gotten off the phone with Cal, my PI, and his latest report had hit me like a punch to the gut. Camille wasn't just cheating me out of money. She was cheating on me, period. There was another guy, Jordan, some finance manager from the city. They'd been together for a year, engaged even, and she'd fed him a whole story about being single, about needing to finalize a divorce from an abusive ex. That ex was me, I guessed, though I'd never laid a hand on her or anyone. I'd spent the last decade building houses, not breaking people. But here I was, the bad guy in her lie, while she played house with someone else. Cal's email had pictures, blurry shots of her and Jordan at a coffee shop, her hand on his, him smiling like he'd won the lottery. There were bank records too. He'd wired her thousands for legal fees, probably thinking he was helping her escape me. I didn't know whether to laugh or smash something. Instead, I'd called Jordan, tracked him down through a mutual contact Cal dug up. Told him I needed to talk, man to man, no details over the phone. He'd agreed, sounding confused but curious, and now I was waiting for him to show up. The bar's neon sign buzzed overhead, casting a red glow across the parking lot. I saw him pull in, a gray sedan, nothing flashy, and step out, a tall guy with glasses, dressed like he'd just left an office. He spotted my truck, hesitated, then walked over. I got out, leaned against the hood, and sized him up. He didn't look like a threat, just a guy caught in something bigger than him. You Jordan? I asked, keeping my voice even. He nodded, shoving his hands in his pockets. Yeah, you're the husband. The way he said it, like he wasn't sure, made me clench my jaw. Yeah, I said. The one she's still married to. His face went slack, like I just yanked the ground out from under him. We went inside, grabbed a corner booth away from the noise of the jukebox and the drunks at the bar. I slid a folder across the table, Cal's report, minus the stuff about her parents. Just enough to show him the truth. He opened it, flipped through the pages, and I watched his expression shift from confusion to disbelief to something darker. She said she was escaping you, he muttered, almost to himself. Said you were controlling, that she was scared. He looked up at me, eyes wide. You mean me? I nodded, slow and deliberate. That's the story she sold you. Meanwhile, she's been living with me, spending my money, and planning to hand it all to her family. He stared at the table, his hands balling into fists. I could see it sinking in, the betrayal, the lies, the way she played us both. We're engaged, he said, his voice breaking. She's got a ring. Said we'd marry once the divorce was done. I leaned back, crossing my arms. There's no divorce. Never was. She's been stringing you along, same as me. He ran a hand through his hair, looking like he might be sick. She asked me for money, 15 grand. Said it was for lawyers. I gave it to her last month. I snorted, couldn't help it. She took 50 from me. Used my name to get a loan. Probably spent yours already. Jordan's jaw tightened, and for a minute, we just sat there, two guys who'd been chewed up and spit out by the same woman. I didn't hate him. He was a victim too, just like me, only he didn't have the years of history to soften the blow. What do we do? He asked finally, his voice low but steady now. I tapped the folder. We've got proof for her lies, her scams. I'm already working with a lawyer and a PI. Her family's in deep too, fraud, debts, the works. They're trying to take everything I've got, but I'm fighting back. You in? He looked at me, then at the ring on his finger, the one she'd given him, probably bought with my cash. He slid it off, dropped it on the table, and nodded. Yeah, I'm in. I smiled. just a little. Camille thought she had us both fooled, but she just handed me an ally. And together, we were going to make her regret it. I was sitting in my living room, the blinds half open, letting slivers of afternoon light cut across the hardwood floor. The house felt empty without Camille. She'd left that morning for her weekend trip to Atlanta, the one she'd told me was a work thing. I knew better now. She was taking Jordan to meet her parents, probably spinning more lies about her divorce, being close to Dawn. My coffee sat cold on the table, next to a stack of papers Teresa had dropped off earlier. I'd spent the last few days planning, piecing together everything we had, me, Jordan, Teresa, and Cal. It wasn't just about fighting back anymore. It was about setting a trap so tight they'd never wiggle out. I picked up my phone and called Jordan. "You ready?" I asked when he answered. His voice was steady, a little rough, like he'd been up all night thinking. "Yeah, she's picking me up in an hour. I'll keep her busy." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Good. Stick to the plan. Act normal. Let her take you to the estate. I'll handle the rest." We hung up, and I leaned back on the couch, running through it all in my head. The weekend was our shot. Camille thought she was in control, parading Jordan around like her shiny new fiancé, while her parents waited for me to sign that contract back home. They had no idea we were working together, no clue about the net closing in. Teresa had been busy. Legally, we were solid. She'd pulled bank records, the forged loan docs, and every shady email Camille had sent me about money over the years. Cal had gone further, tracking down 2 other guys Camille had scammed before me, smaller cons, but the same playbook. They'd given us signed statements, happy to see her pay. Then there was Lydia, the forensic accountant I'd brought in last minute. She was a friend of Teresa's, quiet but sharp, and she'd spent days untangling the Hartleys' finances. I met her at a coffee shop the day before, her laptop open to a spreadsheet that made my head spin. "Silas's shell companies are a mess," she'd said, pointing at rows of numbers. "He's been funneling cash, yours, Jordan's, anyone's, into them to keep the estate afloat. But it's not enough. They're 3 months from losing it all." I'd stared at her, the weight of it sinking in. "Foreclosure." She nodded. "Unless they get a big infusion like your assets, they're done." That's when it clicked. They weren't just greedy. They were drowning, and I was the lifeboat. The contract wasn't a power play, it was survival. Knowing that made the trap sweeter. I told Jordan to wear a wire, a little recorder Cal rigged up, hidden in his jacket. He'd get Camille talking about me, the divorce, the money, while Teresa and I waited back here, ready to move. Cal was on the ground in Charleston, tailing Silas and Lorraine, snapping photos of any shady meetings they took. Lydia was tracing every dollar, building a money trail that'd hold up in court. We weren't just guessing anymore. We had proof, mountains of it, and we were about to drop it right in their laps. I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and grabbed a beer from the fridge. The cold bottle felt good in my hand, grounding me as I thought about Camille. I could still picture her that morning, kissing my cheek, saying she'd be back Sunday night. "Love you," she'd said, her voice light, like nothing was wrong. I'd smiled back, said it too, but inside I was boiling. How long had she been this person, this liar, this thief? Had she ever loved me? Or was I just the mark she'd picked 6 years ago? I took a swig, letting the bitterness match what I felt. The plan was simple but tight. Jordan would play along, get her to the estate, record everything she said. Cal would watch the parents, catch them off guard if they tried anything stupid. Teresa would file an emergency injunction Monday morning, freezing their accounts based on the fraud evidence. And me? I'd be the one to pull the trigger, call Silas that night, tell him I knew everything, let him sweat before the hammer fell. I walked back to the couch, set the beer down, and picked up Teresa's latest draft, a letter to the bank, demanding they investigate the loan Camille took in my name. It was ready to send, just waiting for the weekend to play out. I glanced at the clock. Jordan would be with her soon, stepping into her world, letting her think she'd won. I almost felt bad for her, but then I remembered the contract, the whispers, the years of lies. They built a burning house and tried to lock me inside without a word. Now I was the one with the match, and I was going to watch it all go up in flames. I pulled up to the Hartley estate that evening, my truck rumbling over the gravel drive, the headlights cutting through the dusk like a warning. Jordan was already inside. I'd gotten a text from him an hour ago. "Here. She's acting normal. Wires on." My heart was pounding, but my hands were steady as I parked out of sight, just beyond the big oak trees lining the property. This was it. The next dinner, the one Camille thought would seal her little double life. introducing Jordan to her parents while I sat home clueless. She had no idea I was here, no idea Jordan and I were on the same side now. I grabbed the folder Teresa had prepped, stuffed with enough evidence to sink a ship, and stepped out into the cool night air. The plan was simple: crash their party, drop the truth, and watch them scramble. I walked up to the front door, my boots quiet on the stone steps, and rang the bell. The sound echoed inside, sharp and final. Lorraine opened the door, her smile tight, like she'd been expecting someone else. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice clipped, her eyes flicking past me like she thought I'd brought an army. I smiled casual as I could. "Thought I'd drop by. Family dinner, right?" She hesitated, then stepped aside, her face hardening. I walked in, the familiar smell of lavender hitting me, but it didn't feel welcoming anymore. It felt like a mask. The dining room was alive with voices: Silas's low growl, Camille's light laugh, and Jordan's careful tone. I stepped around the corner, and there they were. Silas at the head of the table, Camille beside Jordan, her hand on his like they were some happy couple. She saw me first, and her laugh died mid-breath. Her eyes went wide, her hand dropping from Jordan's so fast you'd think it burned her. "Babe?" she said, her voice high, confused. Jordan looked up, playing his part perfectly. He dropped her hand too, stood up, and stepped back, his face a mix of shock and anger. "Surprise," I said, keeping my tone light, like I was joking. Silas shot to his feet, his chair scraping the floor. "What the hell is this?" he barked, his face red already. Lorraine rushed in behind me, her voice shrill. "You need to leave now." I ignored her, set the folder on the table with a soft thud, and looked at Camille. "Thought I'd join you and your fiancé here. Nice ring, by the way." Jordan pulled the engagement ring off his finger and tossed it at her feet. It clinked against the hardwood, rolling to a stop near her chair. She stared at it, then at me, her mouth opening but no words coming out. That's when Teresa walked in, right on cue, her heels clicking like a countdown. She dropped a binder next to my folder, thicker than theirs, and said, "Fraud. Identity theft. Bigamy. Shall we begin?" The room exploded, Silas shouting, Lorraine screeching about betrayal, Camille stammering excuses that didn't make sense. "It's not what it looks like," she cried, standing now, reaching for me like she could still fix this. I stepped back, out of her reach. "Save it," I said. Jordan crossed his arms, staring her down. "You told me he was abusive. You told me you were free." She spun to him, panic in her eyes. I didn't mean it like that." Silas slammed his fist on the table, dishes rattling. "This is a family matter." "You've got no right." I cut him off, my voice cold. "No, this is a criminal matter." I opened the folder, pulled out the top page, the bank statement showing the loan she'd taken in my name, wired straight to one of his shells. "And this? This is just the start." Lorraine grabbed at the binder, but Teresa pulled it back, calm as ever. "You'll see it all in court," she said. "Every lie, every dollar." Camille was crying now, big messy sobs, but I didn't feel sorry for her, not anymore. I'd spent years loving her, trusting her, and she'd turned me into a pawn. I looked at Silas, his face a mask of fury, and dropped the final bomb. "The inheritance you're all banking on? The estate? Court's freezing it Monday. You're done." The silence that followed was thick, delicious, like I could taste their fear. Silas's hands shook. Lorraine sank into a chair, her head in her hands. Camille just stood there, tears streaming, looking between me and Jordan like we'd ruined her life. But they'd ruined mine first, or tried to. I turned to Teresa. "Let's go." She nodded, picked up the binder, and we walked out, leaving them in the wreckage of their own making. The trap was sprung, and they'd walked right into it. I stood on the porch of the Hartley estate as the police lights flashed across the lawn, red and blue bouncing off the big white pillars like some twisted celebration. It was hours after the dinner showdown, and the night had turned chaotic fast. Jordan and I had stepped outside after I dropped the estate freeze bomb, letting Teresa handle the legal fallout with the binder. We didn't have to wait long. Jordan had called the cops right after he tossed the ring, pressing charges for fraud and theft based on the money Camille had squeezed out of him. I'd followed suit, handing over the forged loan docs and the recordings from my safe deposit box. The evidence was airtight, and the police didn't waste time. I watched as two officers led Camille out in handcuffs, her head down, her dark hair falling over her face. She didn't look at me, not once. Part of me wanted her to, wanted to see if there was any shame or regret in her eyes, but the bigger part just felt numb. She'd been my wife, my partner, and now she was a stranger in zip ties, shuffling toward a squad car. Silas came next, his hands cuffed too, his voice booming as he yelled about lawyers and rights. Lorraine trailed behind, no cuffs yet, but her face was gray, like the life had drained out of her. The cops had warrants, tax evasion and wire fraud for Silas, identity theft, and bigamy for Camille. It was a mess, and I lit the match. Jordan stood next to me, his arms crossed, watching it all unfold. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quiet under the sirens. I nodded, though I wasn't sure. "Yeah, you." He shrugged. "Better now." We didn't say much after that, just watched as the cars pulled away, taking the Hartleys to whatever came next. The estate loomed behind us, dark and silent now, a shell of what it had pretended to be. By morning, the bank would slap a foreclosure notice on it. Lydia's work had confirmed they were months behind, and the injunction Teresa filed would lock it down tight. The news hit fast. I woke up the next day to my phone buzzing texts from buddies, a couple of clients, even my old high school buddy who'd moved out west. "Saw your wife on TV," one said. I turned on the news, and there it was, high society family falls and fraud scandal. The anchor rattled off the charges, showed grainy footage of Camille in cuffs, and cut to a shot of the estate with a foreclosure sign already up. They loved the twist, self-made husband duped by a fake rich family, turning the tables with proof and grit. My name was everywhere, and I hated it, but it felt good too. The Hartley name was ash now, their fancy friends wouldn't touch them, their legacy was a punchline. I met Jordan for coffee later that day, a little place downtown where no one knew us. He looked tired, but there was a lightness in his eyes I hadn't seen before. "They're saying she might get 5 years," he said, stirring his coffee. "Her parents too, if the tax stuff sticks." I nodded, sipping mine. Good. They earned it. We sat there, two guys who'd been burned by the same fire, but we weren't enemies. He'd lost money, I'd lost years, and somehow that made us allies. "What's next for you?" I asked. He leaned back, thinking. "Get my life back. Maybe sue her for the cash she took." He paused, then smiled a little. "You." I set my cup down. "Same. Business is still mine. They didn't get that. Gonna keep building." We didn't talk about Camille much after that. She was gone, out of our hands, facing what she built. The cops had everything they needed. Jordan's wire from the dinner, my recordings, the bank records Lydia traced. It was over. Driving home, I passed the old neighborhood where I'd flipped my first house, a little bungalow I'd bought cheap and turned into something solid. It was still standing, still mine in a way, a reminder of what I could do. The Hartleys had tried to take that from me, to burn it all down and dance in the ashes. But I'd walked away with the truth, and they were the ones left with nothing. Jordan texted me later. "Thanks for pulling me in. Got my justice." I wrote back, "Got my closure." And that was it, the end of their game, the start of something new. The sirens were quiet now, and the ashes were theirs to choke on. I sat at my desk in the office a few months later, the morning sun streaming through the blinds, painting stripes across the stacks of blueprints and contracts in front of me. The chaos of the Hartleys was behind me now, Camille in jail, her parents broke and disgraced, their estate sold off to some developer who'd probably turn it into condos. My life had settled into something quieter, but sharper too, like I'd sanded down the rough edges and found a better version of myself underneath. The business was humming again, property development had always been my thing, and I'd thrown myself back into it, flipping houses with a focus I hadn't had in years. But I wasn't the same guy who'd walked into that first dinner with Silas's contract. I was smarter now, harder maybe, and I wasn't about to let anyone blindside me again. Teresa had stuck around after the legal mess cleared. She was too good to let go, so I'd put her on my advisory board. She'd sit across from me some mornings, like today, sipping coffee and tossing out ideas about how to protect what I'd built. "You need a trust," she'd said once, flipping through a legal pad. "Not like theirs, something real, something yours." I'd nodded, liking the sound of it. Cal was on the board too. His PI skills had saved my skin, and now he was helping me vet new deals, sniffing out anything shady before I signed. Then there was Lydia, the accountant who'd cracked the Hartleys' money trail wide open. She'd restructured my accounts, set up alerts for anything weird, and made sure every dollar was where it belonged. I trusted them, really trusted them, and that felt new after everything with Camille. I'd started doing workshops too, something I never thought I'd touch. It came out of a late-night talk with Teresa, when she'd said, "You've got a story, use it." So I did, small groups at first. Guys like me who'd been burned financially or emotionally in relationships. I'd stand there in a community center room, no tie, just jeans and a flannel, talking about red flags, bank accounts, and how to spot a lie before it costs you everything. They'd nod, ask questions, and I'd feel this weird mix of pride and relief, like I was turning the mess into something useful. Jordan got in on it too. We'd partnered up to start a nonprofit, Second Chance, for men who'd been scammed or manipulated. He'd handle the finance side. I'd bring the real estate know-how, and together we'd help guys rebuild. It wasn't big yet, just a website and a couple meetings, but it felt right. He'd text me updates sometimes, like got a donor, $5K, and I'd grin, knowing we were making a dent. Camille's trial had wrapped up a month ago, and it was all over the news, headlines screaming about the fraud wife and her high society fall. I'd watched some of it on TV, or on the stand in an orange jumpsuit, crying like she was the victim. She tried to spin it, said she was pressured by her parents, that she loved me, that it was all a mistake. But the evidence was a brick wall. My recordings, Jordan's wire, Lydia's money trail. The judge didn't buy her tears. She got 5 years, no parole for at least 3. Silas and Lorraine lost everything, assets seized, fines piled up, their name trashed now. I didn't go to the sentencing. Didn't need to. I'd said my piece when I walked out of that dinner. Back at the office, I stood up, stretched, and walked to the window. The street below was busy, cars rolling by, a guy unloading lumber from a truck. My world was still here, still mine. I'd lost a marriage, sure, but I'd gained something too, a clarity I hadn't had before. The phone buzzed, a new client, wanting a quote on a fixer-upper. I smiled, grabbed my keys, and headed out. Later that night, I met Jordan for a beer at our usual spot, a quiet bar with sticky tables and decent wings. He looked good, lighter, like he'd shed the weight of her lies. "Trial's done," he said, raising his glass. "To picking up the pieces." I clinked mine against his. "To building something better." We drank, talked about the nonprofit, and I felt steady, really steady, for the first time in a while. Camille was gone, her parents were ghosts, and I was still standing. The pieces were mine to put back together, and I was damn good at building. I stood at the gate of the old Hartley estate a year later, my boots crunching on the gravel, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across what used to be their perfect lawn. The place looked different now. New owners had taken over after the foreclosure, and the big white pillars were freshly painted, the gardens trimmed back into something simpler. A for sale sign was staked near the road, some real estate agent's name plastered on it, and I wondered who'd buy it next, if they'd ever know the mess that went down here. I'd driven out on a whim, not sure why, just feeling this pull to see it one last time. My truck was parked a few yards back, the same beat-up rig I'd had since the start, and I leaned against the gate, hands in my pockets, remembering the first night I'd walked through it. Back then, I was nervous, eager to impress Camille's family, blind to what they had planned. Now, I wasn't that guy anymore. I wasn't angry either, just done. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, and I let the memories play out. Silas sliding that contract across the table, Camille's fake smile, the way it all unraveled when Teresa walked in. It felt like a lifetime ago, but it had only been a year. A year of trials, headlines, and rebuilding. I'd come out stronger, my business was thriving, the nonprofit with Jordan was growing, and I'd learned to spot a snake before it bit. That night, I was meeting Jordan for drinks, so I headed back to town, the estate shrinking in my rear view. The bar was our usual spot, low lights, cold beer, a jukebox humming in the corner. He was already there when I walked in, 2 bottles on the table, and he grinned as I sat down. "Thought you'd be late," he said, sliding one over. "Got caught up looking at the old place," I admitted, taking a sip. "It's different now." He nodded, like he got it. "Good different." I shrugged. "Just different. Doesn't feel like there's any more." We clinked bottles, and he pulled a key out of his pocket, setting it between us. "What's this?" I asked, picking it up. "For the nonprofit," he said. "Rented an office, small, but it's ours. Thought you'd want to check it out." I turned the key over in my hand, feeling the weight of it. Second Chance had started as a side thing, a way to help guys like us, but it was real now. Donors, a couple part-time staff, even a guy who'd come to us after his ex drained his savings. I'd given Jordan the key idea earlier, half joking, but he'd run with it. "We're just getting started," I said, echoing something I'd told myself a dozen times. He laughed. "Damn right." We talked for a while about the office, a new property I was flipping, how he'd started dating again but was taking it slow. Camille came up once, just a whisper of her name. Heard she wrote you, he said, casual, like it didn't matter. I nodded. Yeah, didn't open it. She'd sent a letter a few weeks back, her handwriting on the envelope, postmarked from prison. I'd held it for a minute, then tossed it in a drawer. Maybe I'd read it someday, maybe not. Silence was my answer for now, and it felt louder than anything I could have written back. Revenge wasn't what I'd wanted, not the burning, raging kind. It was quieter, colder facts and timing, letting the truth do the work. Silas and Lorraine were ghosts, their social circle gone, their money seized. Camille was locked up, her lies exposed. I didn't need to gloat. I just needed to keep going. The bar got louder as the night wore on, folks laughing, glasses clinking. Jordan and I finished our beers, and I paid the tab, my turn this time. Outside, the air was crisp, the street lights buzzing softly. See you at the office tomorrow? He asked, heading to his car. Yeah, I said. Gotta break it in. He waved, and I climbed into my truck, the key still in my pocket. Driving home, I passed one of my old flips, a little house I'd turned into something solid years back. It was still there, lights on, someone's life inside. I smiled, small but real. The Hartleys had tried to take everything, but they'd lost instead. I'd built a new start from the wreckage, not with fire, but with what I'd always been good at, putting things together, one piece at a time. And that was the last laugh, mine, quiet and steady, echoing louder than they'd ever know.